Hey guys, it's Phantom here and welcome back to a brand new video everyone. So in today's video I am going to be going over certain spells in Wizard101 that you should absolutely not train whatsoever, as well as some spells that you could train if you want but are definitely not necessary in the grand scheme of questing. With that being said, I hope this video helps you out when it comes to, your decisions regarding what you're going to spend your training points on in Wiz. So the first type of spell that you're definitely not going to want to be training is the taunt and pacify spells, or like these calm subdue spells, basically the spells with all of the bird icons as well as these like golden skull icons. These spells are just really not useful whatsoever, so as you can see, you can train them from Mortis right here, and I believe there are also other vendors in the spiral where you can actually train some of these same spells as well. I believe there is I think there's like a NPC in Celestia in the Watermole village that like trains some of these bird spells as well. He trains like the mega versions of these, like the so-called upgraded versions, but they're really not useful at all whatsoever. So let's just go to the distract spell here. So this will generate a threat onto your target, basically making it more likely that that the opposite team would attack him, and this is purely used in PvE. And it's just overall a really bad spell. I think like the only difference between these two is this one might like generate a little bit more threat like onto said person that casts it or is casted onto. And then there are these spells which reduce that sort of threat on the target and make it less likely for the enemies to actually attack them. And these spells just aren't really useful at all. I don't understand why you would spend like 2 pips. Let's say I was part of the fire school right here, right? And I guess you can get pacify for free right there. I guess there's like multiple spells that take different amounts of pips, but let's say I am a fire wizard. I'm not going to spend 2 of my hard-earned pips trying to reduce the threat on whatever target I cast this on, because it's just simply not really that worth it. Even if you're like about to die, there's still always a chance that you're gonna be attacked by the enemy. These spells are just absolutely a waste of a training point. I highly recommend not buying these spells or learning these spells, because they are just simply not that worth it and really not that useful at all. These like functions in these like sort of threat functions and the reducing like threat functions have never really been a prevalent thing when it comes to combat in this game, so that is why I think that you should not train these spells. The next type of spells that I would not recommend going for are going to be these spear spells. Now, I just really don't see much of a use for these in PvE. I mean, when you're like sort of just building up your hit and blading more and more, most of the time you're really not going to need any sort of extra pierce. Now, I'm not really sure like how these spells are used in PvP or if they are relevant at all. I'm not really sure, but this is a PvE list. So as for PvE, you're really not gonna be needing these spells at all whatsoever. I mean, you can go ahead and like train your schools just because it's free, and I guess if you're like a spell collector or something like that, then go ahead. But at the end of the day, the way I see it, there really isn't a point to training these spells, because Pierce is a stat that just really is not that useful when it comes to PvE, because, most of the time, at least in my experience, I've been recently questing Avalon on my myth, and even when I'm fighting myth mobs, if I just blade up a little bit and crit, and now that crit is super high these days, combined with the damage I have and the blades, it really just kills the enemies of the same school no problem, and also hits through shields super duper nicely. So spells like these, in my opinion, are just really not necessary to learn, because Pierce as a stat just isn't really that important when it comes to fighting mobs. So this next segment of the video isn't really talking about one specific type of spell that you shouldn't train, and more so just me capitalizing on the fact that you should definitely not train every single spell in another school and basically learn a secondary school. That's really all of this segment is telling you about. Do not train into a secondary school, okay? There's no reason why you should need all of the myth spells all the way up until Earthquake if you're not the myth school. It just makes absolutely no sense. Even with mastery amulets, these kinds of setups really are not worth it, because the thing is, the gear that you are going to be getting, you know, like the really special powerful gear that you're going to be getting from special dungeons and bosses and such, will have damage that caters to your own school. So if you train into a secondary school, it is really just going to be much weaker. So I cannot stress the importance enough of not training really any single school's like all of their spells, and have, you know, you be one school and then be all encompassing in terms of the myth school. It just makes absolutely no sense. Now, that's not to say that you should train into other schools, not at all, because, you know, for example, some people might want Satyr. You know, if they're, I don't know, if they, you know, plan on healing themselves, or if they don't have any good heals, they should train into the life school up to Satyr. If that's their personal preference, that they could do that. Another example where this same principle holds true is going to be the Feint spell that you actually learn from the Death School. So you'd want to train up to level 26 into the Death School to get that Feint spell. But then beyond that, you wouldn't want to train any more Death spells. You can train into certain schools for certain spells that you want, but I would not recommend training into an entire school, as that's just a huge waste of points and it's not going to help you out really at all. The next type of spell that you're definitely not going to want to be training into is going to be the steal health from minion spells in exchange for health or maybe pips. I mean, these just really are not useful at all. Minions already in Wizard101 are just really not that useful. No one really uses them in PvE because they're just simply not that helpful. And, you know, in order to use some of these spells, you would actually have to summon a minion first, you know, to take that 500 health away, or maybe sacrifice the minion for 3 pips. You'd actually have to cast a minion spell in the first place to actually do that. So you'd have to cast one unhelpful spell already, and then use another unhelpful spell to get, you know, something helpful, I guess, something semi-helpful out of it, which just really makes no sense in my book, because you're already just going to be wasting so much time while doing this, when, you know, that time, those rounds could be better spent blading up and actually hitting, you know, than summoning minions and, you know, just killing them willy-nilly. These spells are just really not useful for PvE in my opinion at all, and I would highly recommend not training them, because the importance of minions, you know, especially now, is just really not all that high. Next up, we are going to be talking about shadow spells a little bit, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, so I'm just kind of going to break these down one by one. So donate shadow, I mean, this spell is pretty self-explanatory. All you're doing is really just giving a shadow pip to a teammate. I mean, train this if you want, but really you don't have to, because I want to mention that on none of my wizards I have ever used this. I've never used this spell on any single one of my wizards, so in my opinion it is a little bit of a waste of a point, but if you are a support school, I could see why this is useful. As for the Dark Nova and Dark Fiend and whatever third one that you get as, you know, as like a free reward for doing the quest, these ones are really not that useful at all in my opinion. I mean, I'm never going to spend like, is that cost 2 shadow pips? Are you fucking kidding me? I'm never going to spend 2 shadow pips to actually cast one of these spells, even though they do like a decent amount of damage and they cost 0 pips. You're never gonna find yourself actually casting these, just in my opinion, because there are shadow enhanced spells out there that only cost 1 shadow pip and a few regular pips that are just way more effective and actually use your school's damage and everything to hit, and just overall make much stronger hits out of the pips that you use for them. So I don't really know how these function in PvP, but as for PvE, I would definitely not recommend training them. And then as for the Shadow Shrike, the Shadow Seraph, and there's like one more. It's called like I think it's the Shadow Sentinel one, which is the one I got for free on this wizard. These, in my opinion, are not really very useful for PvE either. You're really not going to be using these that much. However, these are definitely a bit more useful than these ones in my opinion, because, you know, maybe there are instances if the boss is shielding like a crap ton where you might want to use Shadow Shrike. If you are going for a healing setup, then maybe the Shadow Seraph might be useful. So I would recommend training it if you're thinking about doing something like that caters to each one of these spells. And then for the tank roll, if I can show you the, no wait, that's not it. If I could show you the Shadow Sentinel spell right here. There's also that Dark Shepherd one, which, you know, goes in line with those other 2 shadow pip spells. But, and then as for the Shadow Sentinel, you know, you could train it if you want, if you are planning on tanking. I'm pretty sure, I think people just get the Shadow Trickster spell anyway. I mean, this one's not really that useful either, but yeah. With Shadow spells overall, it really just comes down to, you know, the certain strategies and builds that you have. But I would definitely not recommend training these ones because they are extremely useless in my opinion. Now, I know I joke about the Moon School a lot on my channel, but guys, as for the polymorph spells, I'm really just trying to help you all out here. Do not train them. Do not waste your points on these polymorph spells. They're just really not worth it at all. So if you guys don't know how these spells work, basically, you know, you cast one of these moon spells and you polymorph into, you know, whatever mob that it says, and then you get a bunch of spell cards that caters toward that that mob's, you know, build pretty much, and you can use those, and you spend, you know, 6 rounds as that mob using those spells. And it's just really not that useful. It's just really not that useful. I feel like this one is super self-explanatory, but you know, moon spells and you know, actually just polymorphing into other mobs, the spells that you the spells that you get, I suppose, from each polymorph just really are not that good, and you're just really going to be doing less damage as one of these mobs than, you know, let's say if I had all of my gear equipped and I wasn't actually polymorphed and I was just casting like the regular spells in my deck. I would be doing so much more damage than if I was in one of these forms. So this pretty much goes for all of the moon spells, really. This pretty much goes for all of them. I don't really know why the school is still in the game. It's just really not that useful in my opinion at all, especially these polymorph spells. Please do not train these. So next up on the list, we have more moon spells right here. Now, I've heard that the shift spells can actually be useful for PvP, but as for PvE, you're really never going to be using these things. So basically what a shift spell does is when you cast it, you know, it shifts your form, much like the polymorph spell, into, let's say, you know, the Grendel form here, and then the Grendel does that set amount of damage as well as those debuffs. And then you literally just shift right back into your player form once again. So it's like similar to a polymorph spell, but also not really similar at all because you don't actually get like a set amount of rounds to play as the specific mob. But these spells are just not good. I mean, these spells are really just not that good in PvE. They're kind of just a waste of time to cast, a waste of pips. Their damage and effects aren't really worth it when in PvE you're pretty much trying to kill as fast as possible. I really think these would just waste a ton of time, and they're just really not that worth it to learn at all for that reason. Just too little damage, and the effects aren't really worth it, you know, for the amount of pips you're wasting. There's just really no point in learning these shift spells. Last but not least, the spells that I'm going to put on this list are going to be a lot of the Astral spells. Now, what I mean by a lot of them, I'll just kind of break them up into 2 categories here. There are the Astral spells that you really don't have to learn if you're just planning on, you know, questing throughout this game normally, and then there's some Astral spells that you absolutely should not learn if you're planning on questing throughout this game normally. So the ones that you should definitely not learn under no circumstance are going to be the Keen Eyes and Accurate spells, as well as, you know, Sniper, and then Unstoppable, and then Extraordinary. I believe that's as far as it goes, right? Yeah, I believe that is as far as those sniper spells go. But you really don't need these. You really don't need these spells because all they do is just, you know, it's a waste of points, first of all. Let me just make that point right now. It's just a waste of training points because what sucks about these spells, and, you know, it gives, you know, you might be looking at it right now and be like, okay, you know, 15% accuracy, then we get 20%, then we get 25% plus pierce, and then we get plus 25% plus 15 pierce. But the thing is, the real drawback of these specific type of enchants is, you know, it gives accuracy, which at a high level you're probably not going to need. And, you know, that coupled with Pierce being a stat that isn't really useful for PvE makes this really not worth it to use. Plus, another thing is it actually takes the place of the enchant. So if I enchant a spell with, like, let's say Unstoppable, right? I'm not going to be able to enchant a spell with Epic because it is already enchanted, right? It's already become a treasure card and I can't apply any new sort of enchant to it. So I would definitely not recommend wasting your points on these spells because you're really not going to use them in PvE at all. Just stick to your regular, you know, enchants that give you more damage. And then as for the other spells that you really don't have to learn, but you could because I guess they are nice to have in some situations depending on how you're going to play the game, is spells like Fortify and like Vengeance and Infallible, you know. and empowerment, etc., etc. These are definitely not the best spells by any means, and I wouldn't really call them necessary for questing. However, if you do want to learn them, you know, spells like adapt, spells like brace, like flawless, like magnify, if you do want to learn them, I don't think it is the biggest waste in the world. You know, spells like radical, actually radical is pretty useful. Spells like renew, you know, just kind of these random ones. I definitely recommend all of these schools actually train their aura, but yeah. But I wouldn't really recommend, I mean, I wouldn't, see, that's the thing with these. It's like, it really depends if you want these spells or not for a specific purpose. So if you're going for like a healing setup, you know, maybe renew would be useful. Of course, you're going to want to train radical, maybe even adapt. So if you're like jading, for example, as well as healing, adapt could be super duper useful, as well as brace, you know, for tanking. It just really depends, but you don't feel like you actually have to train these spells if, let's say, you're just kind of solo questing, because they're kind of useful, like, situationally, but they're not super useful overall. So yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for the video, everyone. I really hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, you could always leave a like on the video or subscribe to the channel. We're actually super close to 11k subs as at the time of me recording this, so that would definitely be super awesome to hit if we could get there, but your guys' support means the absolute world to me. So I really hope this did indeed help you out. Anyways, I will see you all in the next video or stream, whenever that may be, so take care and peace out.